As I may have explained to you, you have the law, which is the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and you have the prophets, which goes from 1 Samuel all the way into all the major and minor prophets. But in between, you have something like the Psalms, and you have wisdom literature from Proverbs and Job and Ecclesiastes. So this is from the Hebrew writings, the book of Job, chapter 23, verses 1 through 9, and then picking up with verses 16 and 17. Listen for God's word to you this morning. Then Job answered, "Today also my complaint is bitter. His hand is heavy despite my groaning. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his dwelling. I would lay my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would learn what he would answer me and understand what he would say to me. Would he contend with me in the greatness of his power? No, but he would give heed to me. There an upright person could reason with him, and I should be acquitted forever by my judge. If I go forward, he is not there. Or backward, I cannot perceive him. On the left, he hides, and I cannot behold him. I turn to the right, but I cannot see him. God has made my heart faint. The Almighty has terrified me. If only I could vanish in darkness, and thick darkness would cover my face." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. In his spoken word poem, Complainers, Rudy Francisco observes, most people have no idea that silence and tragedy have the exact same address. When tragedy first befell Job, when the first messenger arrived to tell him that his donkeys had been carried off by Sabaeans who murdered his servants, and then another messenger arrived to say that fire from God fell from the heavens to burn up his sheep and more servants, and then another messenger arrived to say that Chaldeans had raided and stolen his camels and killed still more servants. And a final messenger arrived to announce that a desert wind had collapsed the house where his children were eating and drinking wine, killing them all. When Job was told all of this, he tore his robe, fell to the ground, and worshiped God. But then his body was afflicted with sores from head to foot, and he sat silently among the ashes. When his friends saw him, they barely recognized him. They sat on the ground with him. And for 7 days and 7 nights, no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. We know that part of the story, but it's just the first chapter or 2. It's way more complicated. And it's complicated by this wrinkle that all this suffering of Job comes about because of a dispute in the heavenly court of God. God boasts to the adversary about how upright and blameless Job is, and the adversary responds by suggesting that Job is this way because nothing bad has ever happened to him. He's been blessed beyond measure. Take it all away, and he will curse you to your face. When Job suffers loss upon loss and continues to worship, the adversary says, well, yes, people will give everything if they can save their own skin, but take his health, and he'll turn on him. This setup should be our first clue that the person of Job probably doesn't exist in history. We don't, as a general rule, have access to the heavenly courts of God or transcripts of the conversations that might transpire in such a place. That isn't what Job is about. The book of Job is about suffering. But more to the point, it's about faith in the face of innocent suffering, meaningless suffering, suffering like we've seen over this past month in the southeast that has no other culprit than a strong wind created by the random atmospheric conditions of a warming planet. The book of Job addresses the perennial question that plagues people of faith, particularly when tragedy strikes. If God is all-loving and all-powerful, then why do bad things happen to good people? Whole libraries of books have been written in response to that paradoxical quandary, many of which sound like the arguments and counter-arguments you'll find made by Job's friends to explain his affliction. Invariably, the answers to the problem suffering creates for people who trust in God hedge on one of those three irreconcilable statements. Maybe, some argue, God isn't as good as we'd like to believe. And anyway, who are we to impose our ideas of what is or isn't good on God? Isn't that the origin of sin in the first place, eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? That sort of thing can be pretty subjective after all. Or others suggest that maybe God's power is limited. Do we really expect God to micromanage all of creation? Could it be that God chooses to limit God's power for the sake of the unfolding of creation? Maybe God's lack of intervention is part of a larger design. Everything happens for a reason, you know. There has to be a reason, right? Or it could just be, as the Buddhist tradition teaches, that suffering is an illusion, brought about by the disordered attachments of our ego. As a reluctant Calvinist, but a Calvinist all the same, I confess that I get hung up on the idea that bad things happen to good people because I'm not so sure anyone is all that good. All sin and fall short of the glory of God, if you know what I mean. But none of these arguments or explanations are new. In fact, you can pretty much find shades of all of them in the bulk of the book of Job, which is largely made up of these discourses between Job and his friends as they look for an answer to the impossible question of why. Still, in these verses, we hear Job insist that he is innocent, that if he could just get an audience with God, he'd plead his case and show that he doesn't deserve any of it. The truth is that some tragedies have a clear explanation, cause and effect. We know all kinds of behaviors and decisions that carry with them elevated risks. This is why actuaries and personal injury lawyers exist, to calculate risk and award damages. The roof of the stadium where the Tampa Bay Rays played baseball is gone because hurricanes cause wind damage. North Carolina, like Houston before it, and any other number of cities hit by weather events, flooded because storms carry and drop enormous amounts of rain. But why a tornado strikes and destroys one house while the house across the street emerges unscathed? We'll never know. And it's a dangerous game to say that God spared one person Or family from a tragedy while another lost everything. Why didn't God spare them? Does God play favorites? The answers to questions like that are shrouded in darkness. And to quote the outlaw William Money to Sheriff Little Bill Daggett in the movie Unforgiven, deserves got nothing to do with it. Even when cause and effect come into play, it's probably theologically unsound to suggest that anyone deserves a bad outcome any more than the person who goes unscathed earned a reprieve. Job says that no matter which direction he turns, he cannot find God. God is absent to him. And in the end, he isn't sure which thought terrifies him more, coming into the fullness of God's presence to plead his case or being without God altogether. In his book, Insurrection, the theologian Peter Rollins suggests that it isn't just Jesus who dies on the cross. It's the whole religious project of managing our relationship with God in order to get what we want and avoid what we don't. Rollins goes so far as to suggest that in his cry of dereliction from Psalm 22, which was our call to worship this morning, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Jesus becomes an atheist. That is, Jesus stops believing in a little g God who never existed in the first place. And maybe that's what happens to Job too. What vanishes in the darkness is neither Job nor God, but a religion built on the faulty premise that the good are always rewarded and the bad are always punished. The little g God who would acquit Job, who can be reasoned with and persuaded to save us from our suffering, cannot be found because that is not who God is, no matter how much we might like to wish so. Instead, God is the one who speaks light into the void and calls forth all of creation. God is the one whose light continues to shine in the darkness, and the darkness does not overcome it. God is the one who brings light out of darkness on the first day of the week and raises what might otherwise be left for dead to new life. I was talking with a friend of mine recently. About 2.5 years ago, he seemingly lost everything. Pushed to a breaking point by traumatic stress, he lost control of his body, and then his job, and then his home, and eventually his marriage. He has known deep suffering. And what struck me when I saw him was how much better he looked. As we talked, he said, "I've learned a lot about myself these past 2 years." And then he added, "Some things you can only learn through suffering." I hated hearing that. I hated to think that it took something as dramatic and painful as what he went through to get to where he is now. But then it occurred to me that maybe that's what Jesus meant when he said whoever wanted to be his disciple had to pick up their cross and follow him. Don't get me wrong. I don't think Jesus wants us to invite suffering. But suffering will find us eventually. One way or another, there's no avoiding it. We don't need to go looking for it. I don't think it's an illusion. It's the reality that Jesus bears witness to on the cross. We can make our case. We can try to reason our way out of it or explain it away and put on a happy face. Aren't we so blessed? We can blame it on ourselves or others. We can wring our hands, protest our innocence, and proclaim our victimhood. Or, in the silence of our deepest, most painful moments, we can be still and know that God has not abandoned us after all. That there is nowhere that God is more present to us than when we are forced to let go of all of our religious ideas about who God is supposed to be in order to encounter the God who truly is. As Barbara Brown Taylor writes in her book, Learning to Walk in the Dark, new life starts in the dark. Whether it is a seed in the ground, a child in the womb, or Jesus in the tomb, it starts in the dark. It starts when we run out of answers, explanations, and even our bitter complaints, and welcome the new thing that begins in the darkness of all that we do not know and cannot understand, where we are held, nonetheless, by a love that refuses to let us go. Hallelujah. Amen.